Sanya, shall we start? You're on mute. Oh, just a second. Yeah.
Yes, hi. Of course, we can start.
Okay, great. So, hi guys. People are still joining in, but I would not want to waste your time. My name is Onisha, and I'm the program manager for the judiciary course at Oliport. Sanya is a very dear friend of mine, and we've worked together in the past. And she's someone who's written the Delhi Judiciary pre and cleared it. So today we are going to discuss how to write answers in the judiciary mains exam. It's going to be a very interesting session because she's not going to teach you just writing the mains answer, but we do have a couple of recent examples through which she's going to show you how do you break down a case law and then write your mains exam. So please stay tuned, and this session is going to be recorded and also uploaded on YouTube. So if you want to check out, you can check it out at a later stage also. Sanya, over to you.
Thank you, Anusha. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I am really, really excited to be doing a lecture with you again. Welcome, everybody. So, just to give you a brief background about myself, I am Sanya Arora. I am an advocate practicing in Delhi NCR for the last 3 years. Yes, I did appear for Delhi Judiciary and I cleared prelims, but because of some personal reasons, I could not sit for mains, but I did prepare for mains. And I have a couple of friends who've also cleared their judiciary and they are currently working as judges in different parts of the country. And I won't name any names, but there are some things that you realize even while you are just preparing for the judiciary exam. Clearing it, not clearing it, being able to, really do justice to the paper is not something that you should stress about. And I would like this session today that we're going to talk about writing answers for judiciary mains. I would love for you to be as interactive with me as possible. We have very little time together. We not only have to share this knowledge and we not only have to have a great session where we are actually understanding each other, but we also have to know each other. So before we begin officially, I would love for you to just write in the chat box where you're joining us from. Have you already sat for judiciary or are you preparing? Or are you here just to learn what it's all about? Whatever it is that you would like to share with us before we officially begin with the lecture, I would love for you to write in the chat box. So I'll show you. So, right, like you can see in the chat box. Hi, Sifa. Thank you so much for joining us, Sifa. Hi, Parmeet. Hi, Kirti. Hi, Mahi. Thank you so much for writing, guys. I know it can be a little cumbersome also, but I love the fact that you are interacting. And let's keep it conversational. I do not want it to be a monologue that I'm just going on and you're not really following, and I'm not hearing your side of it. So please just keep writing in the chat box. And Onesha will help me if you have any particular questions at that particular point. Hi, Mayank. Nice. So, hi, Grishma. So, is there anybody who's already sat for the prelims and cleared prelims, or is now starting judiciary prep, or thinking about starting judiciary prep? You can just write yes in the chat box if you're starting or if you are preparing for judiciary. Hi, Priyanshu. Awesome. Mayank has started preparing. Shrey is going to start. Kirti is starting for it. Neville is practicing at Kerala High Court. That's amazing. Okay, Mahi is going to start. Awesome, guys. Awesome. So this is great. If you are going to start, no matter what stage of your life you're in right now, even if you've been practicing for the last 3 4 5 years, or you're in the first year of law school or second year of law school, it doesn't matter. The fact that you're here and you've decided to start studying for judiciary is in itself an achievement, an accomplishment. Why I say that is because at the end of the day, all of us are from the law background, right? We are either law students, or we are lawyers, or we are interns, or we are studying law in one manner or another. And I keep saying this in all of my conversations, that even if we're not from the law background, although for judiciary you have to be from the law background, we must know the law of the land. And the better you know it, the better protected you are, because we are governed by law regardless. So when you start preparing for judiciary, it's not just studying to become a judge, it's actually studying to understand the law. And even if you don't clear it, and I say that with a pinch of salt because it's a competitive exam, it ensures survival of the fittest, but it does not mean that you're not fit if you do not clear it. It does not mean that you don't have the caliber or the acumen to become a judge. It only means that maybe you are meant for something else. So if it happens or it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter. The fact that you're here, you're preparing for it, will always going to, it will be a benchmark for you that you will set for yourself. You will know the law in a manner that is supposed to be helpful to the people around you. You will be valued as a lawyer, a law student coming from the law background. You will be able to be the best version of yourself in the field of law, no matter what you choose to do. So our agenda is not to, just be like, okay, today I'm going to give you these tips. If you follow these tips, you will definitely clear judiciary. No, our agenda is to understand what are the stages, what happens, what can be the strategies, but we will not rote learn anything. We will not follow each other into anything. We will aim towards the end of this lecture that you are able to recognize which path is best for you. You are able to understand what you need to do, what works best for you. It's not about what I am telling you to do. It's not about what everybody around you is doing. It's about you asking the right questions and figuring it out for yourself. And my agenda is to help you do that today. So, what are we going to talk about? For starters, the first thing that we're going to discuss is the stages of judiciary exams, since a lot of you are going to start preparing for judiciary. Then we will talk about strategies for writing answers. Like I just told you, there is no one way, there is no right way, there is no perfect way. There are just certain strategies. Some things work, some things don't work. What works for one person doesn't work for another person. But yes, there are some things, some bullet points, some markers that you must be aware of in your subconscious or unconscious mind, that you are following that path when you're writing your answer, however you choose to write it. And you must develop your own style to write it. And that is also something that we will discuss today. Then we will be talking about some illustrations. So there are two recent cases that I've picked up for you today. This happens in Delhi judiciary a lot of the times. I'm not sure if you've seen the previous year papers yet, and this, may be twisted in some other form in other states' exams as well, where they give you some facts. It can be a fictional case. More often than not, it's from a real case. They'll take the facts, they'll twist the facts a little bit. They'll say that, okay, this is a case in your court, so you decide. And then you have to write an answer on that. So, how to do that is also something that we will be discussing today by taking two recent judgments and dissecting them to understand the crux, and then to bifurcate them in different parts and subparts and write our answers on them. So, that is also something that we will discuss today. And then I'm going to give you a list of some recommended books. But mind you, what books work for you and what books don't work for you is also very specific to how you want to study or understand a particular topic. These are some books that I have used, and also I was referred to those books by some people that really got my style of learning. And when I received those books, they were really, really helpful when I studied for my mains. So I'm just going to share that list with you and hope that maybe if not that book, you'll find some other book that has that content in a different manner and you're able to understand it better. So the first thing, stages of judiciary exams. So as we all know, it's not just about one exam or two exam or three exams. There are three specific stages for different judiciary exams in different states of our country. They are called Provincial Civil Service Judicial Examination, PCSJ, or JSE, that is Judicial Services Examination. And the syllabus differs from state to state, but the broad stages remain the same. The first is the prelims. As I was talking to you earlier, for those of you joining us late also, prelims are the very first qualifying stage. So just like you go for a sports tournament or you go for any World Cup or a state level sports tournament or anything of that sort, and there are different levels that you have to clear to ultimately go for the World Cup or the ultimate the final round of that particular game or that particular sport. Just like that, in judiciary, which is known to be one of the toughest exams in the country, you have three levels. The first level is the qualifying level of prelims. So the marks also differ, the syllabus also differs from state to state, but basically prelims is about objective type questions where you are supposed to, of course, tick the right answer. If you have given your LLB entrance exam, if you have given your LLM entrance exam, or if you've tried any other competitive exam, it's more or less on the similar lines. It's just that the difficulty level keeps increasing. So in judiciary, the difficulty level is quite high. And of course, yes, in some states, there's also negative marking. In Delhi, there definitely is. And the cutoff for you to clear the prelims also varies from one state to another. So prelims will have objective type questions where you'll get MCQs and you'll have to pick the correct answer. And they usually test you on your general knowledge, your legal awareness, your English speaking skills, sometimes even your Hindi skills, not speaking skills, comprehension skills, and your Hindi or language if it's a specific language that you're looking at. So those are the basic things that they test you on apart from procedure. So if you know a little bit about property industry and if you go to look for a property in the, in a decent area, any property dealer or any broker or any builder that you're dealing with will only suggest the best location. So in the property world, like we say, it's all about location, location, location. In judiciary, it's all about procedure, procedure, procedure. Okay. So they will be checking how well you understand procedure more than the substantive law. So there can be application based questions also, where again, they'll be giving you some facts. They'll give you 4 options in prelims and they'll say, okay, so what will be the best answer here? And then you'll have to, of course, apply your mind. Sometimes there can be straight questions on particular topics of law, such as res judicata or injunction, or say the meaning of murder, or the section, which section it pertains to, or which section of Transfer of Property Act says this, and then you'll have to choose the correct section. So what essentially is something that you need to be very, very careful about, even at the stage of prelims, is the BEAR Acts. So we will discuss that in depth on the following subsequent slides. But for now, you have to understand that BEAR Acts, nothing is more or less important than understanding what the plain language of BEAR Act actually means in the different subjects that you need to cover according to the syllabus that is given to you. So you have to be thorough with your bare acts. Once you clear the prelims, then you go on to the mains, which is the second level. So in prelims, it's just a qualifying exam. So you have to score more than 50% or 60%, and you will be qualifying for mains. And the marks that you score in your prelims is not added to the final marks that will be calculated on the basis of your performance on mains and the interview, which is the third and the final stage, which will then, according to the number of vacancies in that particular state that you're looking at, then qualify you to become a judge. So what happens in mains? Can anybody tell me who started preparing for judiciary? So prelims is MCQs. What happens in mains? Can you write in the chat box? So I also know that you're following me. The answer is also partly in the topic of the webinar today. Just to give you a very big hint. Okay, K is saying subjective answers. Correct. Which is very, very tricky. Now, for most of us have written subjective answers in our law schools or are still writing them. And a lot of the times, I don't know if it happens with you, but it happened with me all of the time, that when I'm writing the answer and I'm getting my marks at the end, when I get my result, I don't really know what was right, what was wrong, how many marks I got for that particular answer based on what, because again, it's subjective, right? So that is very tricky. Prelims are objective. There's one right answer and everything else is wrong. But in mains, when you're writing the answers, the subjective type essay answers, you can never be too sure just exactly what will fetch you the most marks. And that makes it very, very tricky. And that is what we're going to discuss today. Just to point you in the direction of how to mentally prepare yourself and how to start preparing for your mains writing exam. So that is something that we will discuss. Again, some of you have written there are 5 subjects, so there are 4 subjects, and there are theoretical and things like that. So that also depends on state to state. In Delhi Judiciary, you have 4 exams for mains. One is very, very important, that is general knowledge and your language skills. So they will also write, give you questions on translation, Hindi to English, English to Hindi in your one paper, which carries 250 marks along with other general knowledge questions, which will have something or the other from the recent development, current affairs, and you'll have to define it or talk about it or tell why it was in the news. So you have to keep tracking current affairs as well. And then there are, there's a civil 1 paper, civil 2 paper, then there is a criminal procedure paper which carries IPC, CRPC and things like that. And in total in Delhi Judiciary, all the papers combine to I think, yeah, 850 marks. So that is how you are supposed to know just exactly what are the subjects that you need to study for. Which judiciary are you aiming at? And please check the vacancy, check the notifications, check the syllabus only from the official High Court's website. Do not fall for any and everything that you find on the internet. All the links that you find, sometimes they're not updated, sometimes they're for different states than the states that you are aiming at. So you can never be too sure. Always check official um, High Court website. Now, Talin is saying, please repeat these 4 tests. I have a bad connection. That was just something that I was telling you as an example. Not all of you are preparing for judiciary and the Delhi judiciary, and the syllabus also keeps changing every year, but broadly speaking, they have these 4 subjects in Delhi. One is GK and your English Hindi. The second is your civil 1. So civil 1 will carry subjects like contract act, family law, things like that. And there is civil 2, which is difficult, more difficult and heavier because it contains CPC and Indian Evidence Act. So you have to prepare all the subjects equally, because all the subjects apart from the GK carry equal marks. All the subjects are 200 marks each, and the GK one is for 250 in Delhi. So like that, you have to check your state notification. For example, if you are looking for Rajasthan judiciary exams, so you'll go to Rajasthan High Court's official website, and then you'll check the syllabus and the vacancy and the notification for when the exam is going to be conducted, prelims kab hoge, mains kab hoge, and things like that. So usually after the result for the prelims is announced, then you get the date for the mains. Now moving on, after you've scored whatever you've scored in your mains, which can be 650 marks, 700 marks, 850 marks in total, and then the cutoff is also announced by that particular respective state. Once you've scored enough marks, and if you clear your mains, then you go on to the next stage, which is the stage of interview. So you can't really be sure. Even if you've cleared mains, it can't be like, okay, now I am a judge, okay, I have cleared the next level. Usually interview also carries 100, 150 or 200 marks. You are personally interviewed by the judges of that particular state, and they will be asking you whatever they want to ask you, and everything will pertain to law, different subjects of law. And you have to be so well versed with your bare acts that if somebody wakes you up even in the middle of the night and gives you a factual situation and say that which section will apply on these facts and circumstances, you should be able to tell them there and then. That is how well versed you have to be, and that is how strong your preparation has to be. And that begins with prelims itself. When it comes to mains, you also have to focus on writing your answers, on how to articulate what you want to say. So what you must understand is, it doesn't matter if you clear it or don't clear it, like we discussed initially, but if you're appearing for it, start thinking like a judge. When you think like a judge, you know that you have to understand the facts very, very clearly. You have to understand the law very, very clearly, not just to rote learn it, not just to know, okay, this section says this or that section says that, but you also have to know how to apply your mind to apply that particular section onto the facts that are presented before you and pass a just judgment. So start thinking like a judge when you are preparing for your judiciary. Keep your preparation and your style of writing and your style of understanding the law like that. You have to understand the intent or the object of the parliament in enacting a particular law. And law is not something that you can just rote learn like that. You have to learn, unlearn so many things on a daily basis. When it comes to law, there are so many developments, you can barely keep track of them. But like I said, in judiciary, it's the exams are more about procedure. So if you have a very, very good hold on the procedural laws, which are broadly CPC, Civil Procedure Code, CRPC, which is the Code of Criminal Procedure, Indian Evidence Act, then broadly speaking, you will be well versed with whatever other laws are there. Of course, constitution is constitution. You can't overlook that. But if you are, if you can understand the symmetry and the interconnectedness of different provisions of the procedural laws, you will be able to comprehend the problem or the situation that is given to you in your questions in the mains, and then you will automatically have reached that maturity level where you will decide what to write and what not to write. You can't just say that I know this. I know this question very well, so I'll write everything there is to write about it. Everything I've learned. No. Please, whatever you do, when you see the question, when you appear for the exam, just know what are you being tested on. You're going to be tested on your ability to comprehend the situation, on your ability to write precisely, on your ability to articulate well, on your ability to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of law. It's not about you just filling pages and pages about everything you know on the topic that you've been given. It's about you strategizing what is the most important thing that I want to say or I want to write, or that the evaluator will read and know immediately that, yeah, this person knows this particular aspect of law. That has to be on the top. But before all of that, you must identify what are your primary and your secondary sources of study. How will you do that? First, you will understand the syllabus properly. You'll target the states where you want to apply. You'll then understand the syllabus of that particular state, and then you will, start collecting your sources of study. And you have to recognize what is your primary source and what is your secondary source. Now, the first is bare acts. Bare acts. What do you think? Should that be your primary source or should that be your secondary source of study? Just write in the chat box. I have a couple of more. I'm going to ask you. Okay. Talin says primary. Gaiker says, okay. Kirti says primary. Sejal primary. Anuri primary. Okay. So this tells me that you've been paying attention to me. Thank you so much. Diksha says primary. Yes. It's your primary source of study. It's the only thing that really matters, because at the end of the day, everything else is just an understanding or a derivation or an interpretation or a commentary on the bare acts. The law is in the bare acts. You have to study the bare acts. You can't have a shortcut formula for that. You can't be reading smartly, or you can't be cutting off some sections thinking they're not that important and reading the other. It's very important to read the bare act cover to cover, starting with the preamble, starting with the object, and then going towards the end. Even the part that talks about references and everything is also something that can be useful to you. But what I really want you to understand is that if you really want to know the law, understand the law, interpret the law, then you must know the bare acts. And then, of course, we have notes or commentaries. As you must have understood by now, notes, commentaries are secondary sources of study. The case laws, for that matter, are also secondary sources, because you must have read judgments. You must have read some case law or some landmark judgments in your career as a law student or as an intern or a lawyer. And when you are studying the case laws, they are structured in a very particular manner. And that is also something that you will study when you start understanding judgment writing, later on in your prep as a judiciary aspirant. So you will realize that there are these set structures that judgments also follow. First, there will be brief facts. They will tell you just exactly why these parties or these people have approached the court. Then they will also talk about what are the arguments, for on behalf of the plaintiff or the appellant, and the arguments on behalf of the other party, the opposite party. Then what are the issues that have been framed? Now, in civil cases, we say framing of issues, which means what are the points of controversy? What are the bones of contention? What are the main things that have to be decided by the judge? So one person is saying that this other person has taken money from me and never returned it. This person borrowed this amount, did not return it. The other person is saying, I never borrowed this amount. Then the point of the issue becomes, the main bone of contention is whether or not the money was borrowed and not returned. So that is something that the judge will have to decide after listening to both the sides, after examining the evidence, after listening to the arguments, and then eventually passing a judgment. So that is framing of issues in civil cases. In criminal cases, similarly, they have framing of charges. So once the charge sheet is filed, which tells the judge, the magistrate, just exactly under what sections of IPC or any other substantive law this person has been accused, under what sections this person has been kept in police custody or judicial custody, or whatever is the reason that the case is against that person. So the charge sheet will be filed by the police, and then the magistrate will frame charges based on the charge sheet. And then there are arguments on charges also. So that is what happens in criminal cases. And then you have the decision of the court, which is in the ratio, where the judge gives you the reasoning, just exactly why they decided the case a particular way. These are the reasons, these are the precedents, blah, blah, blah. And then ultimately, that becomes your judgment or your case law. So if you study your case law thoroughly, you will not only understand what goes on in the practical scheme of things when the case is born, the case goes to the court, how the judge listens to the case, what goes on in the judge's mind when they're pronouncing the judgment, because it has to be well reasoned, right? So the judge will give the reasons for giving a particular judgment in favor of one party and against another. So you have an insight into the mind of the judge by reading the judgment. Also, almost all of the times, the judgments will be discussing the particular provisions of law, the particular interpretations of different courts of that particular provision of law. That again comes back to bare acts. So when you are interpreting the intent of the parliament or the meaning of a provision, then again you're going back to the bare acts. So even your case laws are a secondary source of study. And then of course you have textbooks, which can be the books that you have in your law school, or also some guides. You can't really be sure how accurate they are, how accurate they aren't, because again, they will be talking about the law, and the law is in the bare acts. They are your secondary sources. So there might be some errors, there might be some mistakes. I would suggest, when you're studying for your mains, to not just look at the guides to understand how an answer is written, just exactly what has been written in a particular question, and to rote learn that. You can refer to guides to look at the kinds of questions that are posed and the kinds of answers that people write, but do not think or assume that that is also your answer, because that is not how the question paper will be framed. And this is not like your law school or any other college exam, where you will just be writing whatever, however, and you will still be getting marks, even if you're writing just exactly what your colleague, what your classmate has written. So you're all writing the same answers, you're still getting the marks. It's not going to be like that. The questions are not framed like that. They require application of the mind, and you can't apply your mind unless you understand the law. And the way to understand the law is to study the bare acts thoroughly. Structure your answer. Now we have moved to the topic of writing for your mains. So you have to structure your answer very, very well. There has to be an introduction, then a main body, which can carry some subheadings, and then eventually you have your conclusion. Now, a lot of you must be thinking that this is what we've studied in our English classes in school also, when we used to write for the writing part and things like that. And in college also, people ask us to just write our answer in this structure. But why exactly? You need to think about the question that is posed in front of you. Take 5, 10 seconds, 15 seconds to just mentally have a structure in your mind. You also have to look at the marks that are assigned to that particular question. So if you go through some previous year papers, you'll be able to see that there is one question that is for 5 marks, then there is another question that's for 10 marks, and there is a 30-mark question. And the length of the question also is sometimes 2 pages, 3 pages, and it's only for 10 marks. The answer is only for 10 marks. So it's not just about you writing whatever you know. It's about you structuring your answer in a way that, first of all, gives the evaluator the idea or the impression that you know the answer right in the introduction. Your introduction should be so catchy, your introduction should be so precise and so articulate that by reading the introduction, the evaluator will know this person knows the answer. The evaluator will not have a lot of time to examine your paper or to mark you. You will have to make sure that you're thinking about what they would want to see. Your key ingredients have to be present in the answer. So, for example, if I'm writing about domestic violence, there's a question, it's a very straightforward question, and they've just asked me to define domestic violence. So, my introduction will not be about what some quotations or any other flowery language where I'm talking about how domestic violence is such a bad thing, or how it's like a blemish on the society and it should be eliminated, or this or that. No, I will be coming straight to the point. In the introduction itself, I will write. So, the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act of 2005 defines domestic violence as this. And then it doesn't matter even if I've not written just exactly what BARE Act says, my keyword should be there. You know, there is physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional or verbal abuse or economic abuse. So I've written that in my introduction. And then in the main body, I go on to explain just exactly what these abuses are, which is given as explanation in the BARE Act. So I explain that in my own words, but I also give subheadings: physical abuse. And then I write, this is what it means. And then maybe I give some illustrations. But since it's a 5-marker, I will not give any case laws or anything. I will not waste a lot of time on this. It's not about even the number of words or the number of pages that you write that will fetch you more marks. In fact, if you go through previous year papers of Delhi Judiciary, you will see they've actually written that the number of pages or the number of words that you write will have no relevance on the marks that you get. And you are required to apply your analytical thinking. What is analytical thinking? It's about you having a problem solving approach. You looking at the question, understanding what is being asked of you, looking at the marks, looking at the time, and then structuring your answer, not just writing everything and anything under the sun on that particular topic. So, my main body will also be very precise. And in my conclusion, I will write about any amendments that there have been in this act, or how this act has, or this particular provision has included mental cruelty in a way that no other legislation has, and that it goes a long way in protecting women who have been hit, hurt, or shadowed or overpowered by the domesticity, by the four walls of their homes, and where they've been abused the most. So, I will try to conclude on a positive note. Now, some pointers. If your question is a positive question that says that, okay, has this helped the society? If yes, of course, you'll write yes. Then you should start your introduction by saying, yes, it has helped, and this has done this to the people, and that happened, and now this is better because of this legislation. But in your main body, also try to put forth some criticism or some negativity or some the other side of it. But it could be better if it also had this, because this country has these provisions and that work very well, so this also can be done here. So if it's a positive question, you incorporate the negative in your answer. If it's a negative question, you incorporate also the positive side. So you're demonstrating to the evaluator that you have a balanced approach. It's not that you have a narrow viewpoint with just one thing stuck in your head, but you are fit to be a judge because you see both sides of it. And in the conclusion, you should always end on a bright note, on a positive note, that even if these are the shortcomings, or this is something that could be improved, there is a bright future for this if all of these are incorporated, and we've already done much better. We are able to stand here and talk about this, and in the future also, if we have these laws, stricter laws and this and that, it will be better. So end on a positive note, always. Introduction should be positive, conclusion should be positive. In the main body, you can also incorporate the other side. And please write subsections or subparts or subheadings so your keywords are right on top. And just by reading the keywords and not going into the other matter or the other content, the evaluator or the examiner is able to understand, okay, this person knows the answer. Another thing that you must be very careful about is that you read the question very, very well and you pay attention to the tail word. What is the tail word that comes in the end of the question? Is it comment? Is it critically analyze? Is it decide? Is it elucidate or explain? Whatever is the tail word, that tail word should be sufficiently answered in your conclusion. So although you'll be answering the entire passage or the entire paragraph or the entire 2-3 pages that you fill out, you'll be answering that question only, but be very specific in your conclusion where you're summarizing all the things that you've already mentioned. At the same time, you make sure that you're not repeating anything and you're not exaggerating anything. So in the conclusion, if they've asked you critically analyze this, so in the conclusion you can write to summarize, my critical analysis entails this. If they've asked you to explain, then in the end you say that this concept is this, to summarize all the pointers that we have mentioned above. Simple, but make sure that you are able to convey to the examiner in the conclusion that you have sufficiently answered the question. Another point that you must keep in mind is that if it's a 10 marker, if it's a 5 marker, how many pages, however many pages you want to write, just keep it similar for all the similarly marked questions. For example, if there are 2 questions and both of them carry 10 marks each, and in one answer you're writing 3 pages, then write 3 pages in the other answer also, because you don't want to give an impression to the examiner that one question you knew better and the other you didn't, or one you cared about more and the other you didn't. So maintain that symmetry, maintain that balance. If you're writing 2 pages, 3 pages for one particular question, make sure that another question that is similarly marked, you're writing similar number of pages. Now, before we move any further, are there any questions, anything that you would like to ask for everything that we've covered till now? If I'm going too fast, if there's something that you would like me to repeat or any clarification that you would want, please write that in the chat box, or you can, I don't think you can unmute yourself, but just you can raise your hand and Anisha will unmute you, or you can just write in the chat box. If there are no questions, you can please write no, so I will get the cue to carry on. Talin has asked, should we opt for coaching for judiciary? Now, that is also a very specific, subjective, personal question. I never went for any coaching myself, and I know a lot of people who didn't. At the same time, I know people who did need that coaching because they needed that structure in their life. So it depends on your style of studying. At the end of the day, you will have to study. Okay, 8 months, 9 months, 1 year, however long it takes you, you will have to study religiously. What coaching does is that they structure things for you. So they save a lot of time in terms of what you need to study, where you need to study from, and then you get your basic synopsis and everything ready, and then you have regular tests and mock tests and things like that. So all of your training or your preparation becomes very structured. But at the same time, there are people who are working, people who don't have that kind of time, and maybe they just want to go for a crash course at the end for 2 months or 3 months. So in that, you have to make sure that you are having a routine. You have a certain amount of time and certain amount of subjects that you need to study on a daily basis, and you must read daily, because you have to maintain your familiarity with the law, with the language of the law. So you have to stay up to date with current affairs. Olive Port has also come up with really interesting courses on judiciary, so you can check those courses out if they work out for you, because that'll be online and the timings are pretty convenient. You will be given recordings of the sessions and the lectures as well, so that can be convenient if you don't have a lot of time and if you're working as well. But at the end of the day, it's a very personal choice, and joining a coaching or not joining a coaching will not determine you getting through this. Okay. So yeah, K has asked, can we have an example question for me, question answer for me? Yes, K, we are going to discuss that in the following slides, the two illustrations that we talked about. And then Kirti has asked how to deal with bear acts. Now that is something that you learn, eventually you do learn, but you have to start reading the bear acts. You have to find the context, the meaning, the intent or the purpose for which that particular law was enacted. We often overlook the definitions clause in Bear Acts, which is usually section 2, or sometimes it's section 3 also in some Bear Acts. We overlook the definitions clause and we go ahead and we choose, pick and choose specific provisions, and then we try to understand what those provisions are, which in my personal opinion is not the right way to study Bear Acts. Like I said, you must start from the first page. Read it cover to cover. It'll take you a lot of time to really understand what the law says and to really understand what the language is all about. But one way to do it is, first you read the Bear Act. Try to pick the slimmest, the smallest. Read it. Then you read commentaries or interpretations or judgments related to it. And then take one provision and start writing about it. Write anything, write bullshit for all that matters. It'll help you identify your blockages. It'll ultimately also help you track your progress in your ability to write what really matters. That's where Prezi writing comes into play. Prezi writing is very important. It's about how you paraphrase what you've written, what you've read. So that will ultimately require you to grasp the main idea and to write it in your own words, while not missing out the keywords or the key ingredients that are present in that main piece that you're trying to paraphrase. So that comes with practice. The more you read, the more knowledge you gain, the better you'll be able to write. So for Prezi writing, I am not too sure if there are any particular books, but yeah, there are a lot of articles, there are a lot of free sources on the internet. When you just write Prezi writing and you'll get the do's and don'ts. More than that, it's about you practicing writing your own self, you practicing, you trying to understand just exactly how well you can be with it. So while there will be some do's and don'ts, that okay, follow this, don't follow this, but until and unless you try to write it on your own, you'll never know. So I would suggest you write whatever you feel like writing and then improve on that, but do write. So before I take any more questions, I think Onisha will also fill me in if there are any urgent questions. Let's just quickly summarize the do's and the don'ts. Okay, so what you do is you start preparing for mains alongside your preparation for prelims. So for prelims also you're studying Bear Acts. For your mains also you have to study your Bear Acts. Everything else, of course, is accentuated. It's the workload, the study load increases with mains because you also have to learn how to write and everything. But when you're preparing for your prelims, mentally prepare yourself that you also have to prepare for your mains. That is a very good strategy to clear your prelims also, and to understand the law better, to finally be able to get the right answer in your prelims also. And after your result of prelims, you don't get a lot of time to prepare for mains, 1 month, 2 months maybe. So if you've already started your preparation, it'll be easier for you to catch up and to brush on basic topics. And please make synopsis of every topic that you're covering. I will show you how, with the illustrations, the notes that I made and the answer that I've written for all of you. I'll show you the difference. I'll show you those notes. They are again only for reference. But make those kinds of notes, make synopsis for your own self in your own language, so you can recall just exactly what that topic is all about. What are the keywords? What are the ingredients that you have to be sure of? Then maintain familiarity with the language of the law. What do I mean by that? You should know the difference between shall and may. You should know the difference between a criminal and a juvenile delinquent. When a juvenile or a child is arrested and convicted for a crime, even under POCSO or any other law, then you cannot call them a criminal. They are juvenile delinquents. You must know that. You must know the difference between evidence and proof. You must know the difference between alleged and convicted. Alleged to have committed a crime or convicted for this crime. So these basic things, very basic, simple things. By language of the law, I do not mean those Latin terms and those fancy words, but basic things that you read in your Bare Act. You must know what do you mean, what do we mean by exhibits and marks. So when we are at the stage of evidence, and that's when practice comes into play. Do not undermine or do not underplay the importance of practice or the practical goings on. Even if you can't go to a court, you can always watch YouTube live proceedings of different courts. Even if you haven't practiced yet, you can read the judgments to know just exactly what happens in which stage. At least you should have a basic idea of the life cycle of that particular case to understand the terminology better. At the end of the day, you as a judge will not be just about the knowledge that you have. It'll be about how you're implementing your knowledge in the practical scheme of things. So for that, develop lateral thinking. Lateral thinking is again a problem solving approach to everything. It's connecting seemingly disconnected things together. So, I would suggest to not just read law books, read novels, read whatever you like to read. Observe people around you. Study of law is just like study of life. The more you understand everything that happens around you, the more you're able to read about it, the more you're able to write about it, the better you'll be able to think about it. And everything is interconnected. Your problem solving approach or your decision making style should also not be very narrow, because if you are sticking to one particular skill set which is not diverse, which does not encompass everything else, it'll be prone to biasness. And as a judge, you can't be biased. You have to be objective. And especially if like I said, you start thinking like a judge right in the beginning, before you even start preparing, think like a judge. You will, if you clear everything, you will be appointed at the subordinate level in the trial court. And like Lord Denning has very famously said, that trial court is a court of fact. So you have to understand the facts very, very well. You have to understand that the facts are of paramount importance. And how will you know or understand facts? You don't just need to know the law for it. You need to know life. You need to know people. You need to know situations. You need to know what's going on these days. And then you need to apply your mind, apply the law to solve a particular problem. So maintain familiarity with the language of law and track current affairs and legal developments. I just told you why. You must always track them. Know the provisions, know the act. So in which act, which Bare Act was enacted, which law was enacted in which year is also something that you must know. What amendment happened? In which year did that amendment happen? What was the purpose of that amendment? You must know. What are the basic ingredients? For example, if we're talking about murder under section 300, punished under section 302 of IPC, what are the ingredients that must be present in that particular situation for the accused to be held guilty of murder and not culpable homicide, not amounting to murder? So you must be aware of those ingredients. Similarly, we are talking about section 138 under Negotiable Instruments Act. What are the ingredients that must be fulfilled for a case to fall under section 138? If those ingredients are not fulfilled, then the case will be dismissed in limine. Dismissed in limine means it will be dismissed in the first hearing itself without going into the details or the evidence or the fact, or without moving ahead with the case at all, because those ingredients are not satisfied. You must know what is the meaning of territorial jurisdiction, pecuniary jurisdiction. Do stress so much on jurisdiction? Because if your court does not have jurisdiction on a particular matter, you can't entertain it, you can't decide it. How can you move further? Be aware of those basic things and the keywords, those ingredients, those acts, if required, should be present in your answer. Don'ts now. So don't accumulate too many books. Like I said in the beginning only, please identify what are your primary sources, what are your secondary sources of study. So you accordingly arrange your study material and stick to it. Worship it, believe in it. Do not keep accumulating books just because this person recommended that book, that person said you buy this guide also. So you'll just be feeling guilty having so many books, not being able to read from all of them. And if you try to read from all of them, you'll be how will you be able to prepare yourself for writing the answers? So don't do that. Then don't ignore the procedure. Like I said, you have to be practical in your approach, and it's all about procedure at the end of the day. What happens to a case, a civil case, when it goes to court? What happens to a criminal case when it goes to court? You have to be very, very clear with the procedure. Okay. And then don't mimic others writing style. Develop your own. Don't be a stereotype. Don't think that I should study 13 hours a day and only then I'll be able to clear it. Don't do that. Don't be cynical, don't be negative, and don't approach it as a college exam like we just discussed. Don't let the world get in your head. There will be people who will be like, you can't do it, you're only studying all day and you can't clear it and everything. Don't let that happen to you. Just believe in yourself. Now we are going to talk about illustrations. We are running short on time, so I'll be a little faster now. In the meanwhile, all of your questions can be collected in the chat box and we can discuss them towards the end. Now, understanding these illustrations is about audi alterum partem, which means that you should hear both the sides. You should know both the sides very, very well. Now, this was one case that was decided recently by Supreme Court in October 2021 only, and this is Ganesan versus State, represented by SHO. And this is the case number, so you can note this down and you can probably read the judgment later. When we are reading the judgments, we have to focus on brief facts, issues, evidence, arguments, rational, like we just discussed earlier. So you read the judgment like that. I'll just quickly give you the background of what happened in this case, and then I'll go on to show how I have written, a summary of the answer for if any question were to present itself from this case. So what happened in this case was in 1996, Ganesan was one of the 5 accused persons who went to commit robbery. Robbery, an exaggerated version of robbery, is dacoity. When 5 people are involved, it becomes dacoity. And you can understand robbery and dacoity by reading sections 390 to 398 of IPC. What is the difference? What happens? How punishment and everything. So Ganesan was the one who was sitting in the car, while the other people, the 4 other people that were with him, they went to proceed with committing dacoity, and they had an iron rod and they also had a knife with them. So Ganesan was sitting in the car the whole time. And the other 4 people, they went, and there was this other person going on a bike. They stopped the person, they snatched a bag from that person, and that bag carried 60,000 rupees and some jewelry, 16 gram of some jewelry. And they also attacked the person who was riding the bike. So they hit him on the head with the iron rod and they showed him the knife. And then there was another eyewitness there, and they hit that person also, and they ran away. And then what happened, interestingly, the person who actually hit them, that person just absconded, ran away, and Ganesan was caught along with other 3 people. And Ganesan confessed to the police that, okay, yeah, I was a part of this, so I did this. Now what happened, the lower courts, they convicted Ganesan under section 397 of IPC. Now, 397 talks about a minimum punishment of 7 years for the offender that uses a deadly weapon while committing dacoity or robbery. So Ganesan was convicted under section 397, and then it went to the Supreme Court eventually. And the conviction was upheld in High Court also, and it went to Supreme Court, and where the question before the court was that should Ganesan be convicted under, was he correctly convicted under section 397? So that is something that can come to you as a question, especially in Delhi judiciary. They have a habit of twisting the facts of real life cases and then presenting those facts and then asking you to say, decide the matter. It's in your court, you decide the matter. Now, just remember that the facts, if they are already given to you in detail in the question itself, do not repeat them in your answer. This is a sample introduction that I've prepared for you. I'll show you the notes that I made for this case also. Now, the introduction says, the factual position being admitted, let us straight away cut to the chase and examine whether a case under section 397 IPC is made out or not. So pay attention to the fact that I did not repeat the facts that were already there, and I have sort of culled out the basic idea of the question which I am being judged on or I am being examined on, and I have just mentioned that in the introduction, which also gives the impression to the examiner that okay, this person knows what this question is all about. Now, the answer will depend on, so the outcome will depend on the answer to the following question. Now, these are the two questions that I've framed, which are essentially the two main issues of the case. The first is whether the appellant accused, now since the accused has gone as in appeal, he will be called appellant accused, used a deadly weapon in order to commit dacoity. Why am I focusing on deadly weapon? Is because section 397 mandates you to actually use a deadly weapon for you to be convicted under that section. So that is a key ingredient. So this is a keyword right here in the introduction that I've mentioned, which again tells the examiner that I know what section 397 is. Then if not, can the appellant accused still be convicted under section 395? Now I have brought section 395 here also. I am not repeating just exactly what these sections are right in my introduction. I can do that later in the main body, but I haven't done that here because I just want to give an impression to the examiner that I know the difference between 397 and 395. 395 talks about punishment for dacoity, which can be life imprisonment or up to 10 years, but does not have any minimum punishment. The minimum punishment requirement is only under 397, which is if you have committed dacoity by using, and while committing dacoity, you were the one using a deadly weapon. So I want to basically exhibit that my appellant, the appellant accused did not use it. So that is why he is not guilty under section 397, but he can still be convicted under section 395. So I've written in the factual matrix, the first issue is decided in favor of the accused and no offense under section 397 is made out. And the second issue is decided against the accused who is guilty under section 395 IPC for the following reasons. So I've reeled in the examiner. Again, this is only for your reference. This is not the right way, the only way. This is just a gist of what you could write in such a situation. It's just an example. Okay. Then main body. Now I come to main body. I'm highlighting this again and again on every slide for you. Read the question. So the question can be anything. You read it and then you answer it accordingly. So here, since I am supposed to decide as a judge, I will say meaning of offender. That became my subheading. So the purport behind section 397 IPC that mandates RI. RI is rigorous imprisonment for a minimum of 7 years to provide a stricter punishment for an aggravated offense of robbery only or dacoity to the offender. So the term offender is used in this particular section. This section specifically uses the term offender, while section 395 providing punishment for dacoity does not. Actual use of weapon is conditio sine qua non. Conditio sine qua non means condition precedent, which means it is the key thing that should be present in a case for that person to be convicted or to be held guilty under that particular section. So this is the main thing that needs to be proved, that the accused used the deadly weapon for liability under section 397. There's nothing on record to prove that the appellant accused used a deadly weapon. He was sitting in the car the whole time, and thus he is not an offender within the meaning of section 397. So just pay attention to the fact that I have not used any flowery or preachy language. I have not gone into the philosophy of it. I have just tried to summarize it in the most precise manner as possible while using the keywords. And I have also mentioned the case laws in the brackets. Reference in this regard may be had to the judgments in Phul Kumar versus Delhi Administration and Dilawar Singh. So I have also demonstrated that I know case laws pertaining to this. This is again in a nutshell for all of you. This can be expanded on, or this can be even more precise depending on your knowledge of it. So when you read relevant laws and recent laws and case laws, you know what the case is about. If a question like this comes to you, you'll know the facts, even the things that have not been mentioned in the question. So you'll be able to understand what you have to write and what you don't have to write. The second point is no constructive liability. So section 397 only envisages individual liability and not constructive liability. Thus, co-accused not vicariously liable for the acts of one accused. So there was one person who was among the gang who actually used a deadly weapon, and my appellant here did not use that weapon, and that means that the appellant cannot be held guilty for the acts of the other accused. Now, in the present case, the appellant accused is not the offender and cannot be held constructively liable or vicariously liable for the acts of the other accused that actually used the deadly weapon, since minimum punishment is of 7 years only for the one that actually used the deadly weapon while committing robbery or dacoity. The appellant accused is not liable to be charged under section 397. So again, I've mentioned one case law. I just saw a question that asked, okay, so how do we go about understanding the case law, and how many case laws should we know? So the more you read, you'll be able to understand the connected cases also. So these case laws that I have mentioned here, I found them within this judgment, and I knew that because I read the judgment. So how you can go about reading and making notes on the judgment, there's a separate video on that we had made. If you just go and search on YouTube, you'll be making case notes on judgments, or reading how to read judgments. There was another video. You can go through that webinar to understand how you can read the judgments and make your own notes, and also know the connected cases to prepare yourself. Now, since we don't have a lot of time, I can't go into depth with that, a lot of depth. But you must know that if you are looking to add case laws, just do not add as many case laws as you know. 3 or 4 are more than enough for one particular topic. If it's a 10 marker or a 15 marker, if it's a 5 marker, you don't really need to mention any case laws, especially if you go into local laws which talks about registration act or stamp fee or court fee act and things like that. You don't need to go into case laws. You must mention case laws when it's a major subject that you're writing about, and it has more marks such as IPC or CRPC or constitution. Then you must incorporate case laws. Also torts, because torts is mostly all about case laws. Now another point here was dacoity proved against the appellant accused. So remember the two issues. The second issue was, I said that yes, the appellant will be convicted under section 395. Why is something that I've answered here. So when a charge of a major offense is not made out, conviction for a minor offense, even in the absence of the charge for the said minor offense, can be sustained if grave offense is not established on merit or for default of technical nature. So the accused appellant can be convicted and punished for a minor offense without altering of the charge. So basically what I mean by this is that I don't need to have another charge of section 395. If 397 is not made out, I can convict this person, this accused, under section 395, because there is no difference between sections 391, 395 and section 397 insofar as sentence punishment goes. So the punishment, there is no difference except for the fact in 397 it should not be less than 7 years. But that doesn't mean that I cannot convict this person. If a case of dacoity has already been proved, this person can be convicted under section 395, because dacoity is an exaggerated version of robbery. Now, just make note of this phrase also. This was coined recently in this judgment, and there are high chances of this being asked in Delhi judiciary especially. So dacoity is an exaggerated version of robbery. How exactly? You read the judgment, you'll know. So prosecution has proved the case of dacoity under section 395. FIR, charge sheet all refer to 5 persons. Hence, dacoity is proved and appellant accused is liable to be punished under section 391, read with section 395 of IPC. Now, I have mentioned another case law here to support this particular argument or this particular point that I'm trying to make. Now, conclusion. So I have kept the conclusion short and sweet. In view of the above and for the reasons stated above, the appeal is partly allowed so far as quashed and set aside the conviction of the appellant accused for the offense under section 397. This is the language that is usually used in judgments. So this goes to show that I read the judgments, I know the phraseology, I know the language, and I'm able to demonstrate it by writing a conclusion like this because you've asked me to decide this case. So the conviction of the accused for the offense punishable under section 397 is hereby set aside, and the appellant accused is convicted for the offenses under section 391 IPC punishable under section 395 IPC and sentenced to undergo 7 years of rigorous imprisonment and a fine of rupees 2,000, because I can also order in that regard, and in default to undergo further 6 months RI. Now, this is what was held in the judgment also. So I made that my conclusion. So letting the examiner knows I am well versed with the latest developments and the latest case laws also. Now, another example for you. This one is a family law case. Pretty interesting, actually. So Neeta Ben Dinesh Patel versus Dinesh Dabai Patel. So you can note down this case number also, and you can check out this judgment. This was also pretty interesting. What happened here was that sorry, before moving forward, I'm also checking the chat box regularly. So when it pops up, there's another question. Can we write short forms in the answers also? So rigorous imprisonment is usually written as RI in judgments also. So while you can, if you don't want to, if you think that, it won't really look nice and you're not comfortable with it, then write full forms. That's also all right. Another reason for me to write RI was because I wanted to fit everything on the slide. So you can write rigorous imprisonment. That won't make much of a difference. Okay. So what happened in this particular case was that they got married in 1987. The parties that are in the case in the cause title. So they got married to each other in 1987. 1990, they had their first child. The woman who's the appellant here and who's also the, she's the appellant here. So she was a practicing doctor, but she stopped practicing after the birth of her child to take care of her child. Now, what the husband did was the husband left them in 2006 and did not pay for their maintenance or anything. He just got up and left. And then he filed a case against the woman, the wife, in 2007 for divorce, for cruelty. Divorce on the ground of cruelty under section 13 IA of the Hindu Marriage Act. So the wife actually came back in her written statement saying that this is the person, my husband is the one who's actually left us, who's not paying maintenance for us, and he's the one who's deserted, and he has an illicit affair with somebody else. And she'd only mentioned that. Now, during the proceedings, what happened was that in the evidence stage, in the cross-examination, it came on record that the husband has married somebody else. So he had a second marriage and he had a child out of that marriage as well. And it came on record in evidence. So that was something, that was a material fact that was hidden from the court. It was suppressed from the court. And so the wife wanted to amend her written statement and include more allegations and more reliefs in her written statement. So she filed an application to amend, and if you'll go through Family Courts Act and Hindu Marriage Act, they follow the civil procedure. So you're allowed to amend, but then there are also certain arguments after the stage you can't amend. I won't go into the details again. So study about it. Order 6 Rule 17 talks about amendment to the pleadings. And so she amended and she said that I want to level these charges, these accusations against my husband. And I also want to seek a relief of declaration from this court, where the court declares that the second marriage of my husband is illegal, it's illegitimate. And the child that is born out of that wedding, that marriage, the second marriage, is also illegitimate, because we haven't been divorced yet. He's still technically married to me, so he can't have a second marriage. Now, what happened was, although the family court allowed amendment and said that, okay, you can include accusations, but we cannot grant you the option of including these paragraphs in your relief and asking for declaration also, because we don't have the power to do that. Only civil courts can declare something. You have to have a civil suit for that. We can't do that. Now, the woman, she approached the High Court, appealed before the High Court, said that no, this is wrong. I should be allowed to do this because under Section 23A of Hindu Marriage Act, I am allowed to set up a counterclaim. Now, the husband also appealed to the High Court and said that how can she be allowed to amend her written statement at all at such a belated stage? It's already at the stage of evidence. So the husband also went to the High Court. The High Court agreed with the husband and passed an order against the wife and said that no amendment can be allowed. So even the amendment that was allowed by the family court, that was also nullified. And they said that you have to proceed with the case like this only, you can't be amended. And then the case went to Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court had to decide was that can any relief be granted against a third party under Hindu Marriage Act? So it can also be worded in any way whatsoever. This was the case. Sorry. So now let's talk about what I've written in the introduction. So the factual matrix again is on record. Case hinges upon the provision of Section 23A, you have to read 23A of Hindu Marriage Act, that allows the respondent to make a counterclaim for for any relief under HMA. Section 23A was introduced. Now I'm writing about, since it's 23A, it is an amendment. So I will talk about when it was introduced and why it was introduced: to prevent multiplicity of proceedings, which is akin to Order 8, Rule 6A of CPC. Now, the following question is to be decided, to answer to decide the present case. Can the appellant wife be allowed to claim relief of seeking declaration under Section 23A? Now, the answer is in the negative for the following reasons. I say that this cannot happen if I am to decide this case. Why am I saying that? This is my main body. Two reasons. One, declaration cannot be claimed under Hindu Marriage Act. If you read Section 23A properly, you'll be able to see they can only grant relief which is under Hindu Marriage Act, which can be only Section 9, Section 10, Section 11, 12, or 13. So you can read up more about these sections. The relief can be granted only under those sections. And whatever relief the appellant has asked to declare that the second marriage is illegal or illegitimate, this cannot be granted under Hindu Marriage Act, and reference can be made to this particular case, Damodar versus Urmila, AIR 1980. No third party relief can be granted under HMA. HMA is just about two people, husband and wife. You cannot seek any order, you cannot seek any relief against a third party. So no relief can be prayed for the third party under HMA. Remedy is available to file another suit or independent proceedings claiming such relief of declaration. In this case, the appellant wife could have sought divorce or judicial separation by way of counterclaim, but could not have sought declaration. This is my main body. Now, conclusion: to summarize, for foregoing reasons, the amendment sought by the appellant, qua para 37, para 37 was what you wanted to add, is dismissed. However, it will be open for the appellant to initiate independent proceedings by way of filing a substantive suit or any other remedy which may be available to the appellant under the law with respect to the prayer sought qua para 37. This is my conclusion. Now, finally, some books to your rescue. I would suggest that you take a screenshot of this. Some books that I recommend. You can go for PSA, Bill Lye's Criminal Law or Criminal Procedure, R.V. Kelkar's. It's very practical. It's very well structured and very simple book to understand. You can also go for Law of Contract and Specific Relief, which is by Avtar Singh. Avtar Singh is like stalwart in the law of contract and these kinds of books. And his books are also very easy to understand. Then Indian Constitution Law by M.P. Jain. R.K. Bangia's Law of Torts, Family Law Lectures by Dr. Poonam Pradhan Saxena, Law of Evidence as amended by the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013 by Ratan Lal Dheeraj, and Key to Indian Practice by Mullah, which is a summary of Civil Procedure Code. So you can, I'll just go back to that slide. So you can just take a screenshot of this slide, or you can watch the YouTube video later and just check out these books. You can check them out on Amazon and see if they're worth your while. They have helped me a lot and I would strongly recommend these books. So I hope you've taken the screenshot. I can come back to this slide if you haven't later. Now, just to end this, Justice Midha said this at his retirement. And this was, Justice Midha was an amazing and extraordinary judge at Delhi High Court. And he said that in court of justice, both the parties, they know the truth. It's the judge who is on trial. So you have to understand the facts. You have to understand both sides of the arguments, listen to them, and then make a balanced, just decision, which is very, very difficult. And that's why the judge is on trial. And when you're studying for judiciary, you have to put yourself to the same standard. Now, you got this. And you can always reach out to me at lawchakrabaisane@gmail.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions. Although I hope that we'll have 5 minutes to discuss something that you would like to talk about, if Anisha would allow. We've already, I think, we've surpassed a lot over the time limit that we had. But please feel free to ask any questions. I think we can spare 5 minutes, Anisha.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Kay. So yes, can we consider writing facts in brief in points of any way? If you're writing the facts again, the facts are given in your question, you're writing them in your answer again, you're just wasting your time and you're wasting those pages. It's just like when we don't know the answer, we repeat what's the question, and then we go ahead and start writing in big letters to just say that we filled the pages, and the evaluator can see, right? So I would suggest against it, but it's completely up to you. I'll also show you the notes that I prepared on the, one second, the case notes, so you can just have an idea. One second. So this was, so when I was reading the case law, I made notes there also. Again, like I said, you can check out that video, how I do it. And here I've just written, this is like my synopsis for this particular judgment. I've written the date, the facts, what are the main arguments on behalf of the appellant, main arguments on behalf of the respondent, then what are these sections. So I've highlighted the keywords, what is important, and these sections are right here. So these sections were discussed in detail in the judgment also. So I know that they are important. You have to understand them. And then the main issues, and then the reasoning for deciding the issue in a certain manner. And then you have a conclusion. Similarly, I've done for the second case law that I just showed you. So this can be like a synopsis of sorts that you can keep with yourself. So you can quickly revise that particular topic or that particular judgment when you are on your revision phase. So you can do that when you're just starting to prepare.